Somewhere in an archive in Nebraska, there is a diary written in a child's handwriting. The ink is brown with age, the pages are brittle, the spelling is imperfect, and in those pages, written by a 10-year-old girl in 1878, is a description of watching her younger brother die of diphtheria on a dirt floor, while her father was 3 days' ride away, and the nearest doctor didn't exist. She wrote it in 2 sentences. Then she described what she made for supper. Because on the frontier, that was life. You grieved in a sentence, and then you kept going. Subscribe and stay with us. Because the children of the Wild West lived a reality so different from our own that it can feel almost impossible to believe. And yet every detail we're about to share is drawn from the historical record. These are their stories. Number 1. Nearly half of all frontier children never reached age 5. Before we begin, you need to understand the single most devastating fact about childhood in the Wild West. Most of it didn't last long. In the 1800s, up to 30% of children died before their first birthday, and 43% did not survive past their 5th birthday. If a child lived to 10, they still had only a 60% chance of surviving to adulthood. Read those numbers again. Nearly half of every child born on the frontier was dead before they were old enough to go to school. The graves in frontier cemeteries are not filled mostly with gunfighters and outlaws. They are filled with children. The common causes of death among children included tuberculosis, croup, whooping cough, smallpox, measles, cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, diphtheria, influenza, and scarlet fever. Diseases we vaccinate against today in a single doctor's visit. Diseases that swept through frontier communities and took children in days, sometimes hours. Some children went unnamed. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Some never had a traditional burial at all. By not naming a child, families could remain unattached until the child reached a certain age, usually their first birthday. Families on the frontier didn't name their babies immediately. For the same reason you don't name a pet you aren't sure will survive. It wasn't cruelty. It was a wound already learned from experience. Number 2. Children started working at age 5, sometimes younger. In the world we live in, a 5-year-old goes to kindergarten. On the frontier, a 5-year-old went to work. Through the first half of the 1800s, child labor was an essential part of the agricultural and handicraft economy of the United States. Children worked on family farms and as indentured servants for others. To learn a trade, boys often began their apprenticeships between the ages of 10 and 14. But on frontier farms, the working age was considerably younger. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to carry water, feed animals, gather eggs, pull weeds, chase away crows, and tend younger siblings. Not as occasional helping, but as daily mandatory labor before and after any schooling. Historians Elizabeth Hamstein and Lillian Schlissel offer a portrait of loneliness, privation, abuse, and demanding physical labor from an early age that bears little resemblance to the romanticized frontier childhood of books and films. Diary accounts from frontier mothers describe children too tired to eat supper, children who fell asleep at the table after working from before sunrise, children who, by the age of 8 or 9, were doing work that would exhaust a modern adult. This was not considered cruelty, it was survival. Every pair of hands, no matter how small, was the difference between enough and not enough, between winter warmth and winter cold, between the family eating and the family starving. Number 3. A frontier child witnessed death routinely and was expected to keep moving. Modern childhood is carefully shielded from death. Children are rarely present when people die. Funerals are managed by professionals. Grief is processed with support. On the frontier, death was a domestic event. It happened in the room where the family slept. It happened during the journey west, beside the wagon. It happened in the field, in the barn, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Often a newborn died on the journey. Diaries record entries like, Mrs. George Belshaw give birth to a daughter 4 o'clock this morning, lived about 2 weeks. Each careful account of another woman's misfortune was a muted protest. Children who survived watched siblings die. They helped dig graves. They sat through services conducted by whoever happened to be present, often not a minister, often not even a neighbor. Sometimes just the family alone on a vast and indifferent landscape. And then they went back to work. The Diaries of Frontier Children contain something that strikes modern readers as almost unnatural, a matter-of-factness about death that reads as emotional absence. But it wasn't. It was the only way a child could continue to function in a world where grief, if fully experienced, would be permanently incapacitating. They didn't feel less. They had learned to feel differently. Number 4. The Schoolhouse, blizzard of 1888, killed children walking home from class, January 12, 1888. On the Great Plains of Nebraska and Dakota Territory, the morning arrived unusually warm and clear. Children walked to their one-room schoolhouses without heavy coats. Some played outside at recess in the mild air. By early afternoon, the temperature had plunged 40 degrees in less than an hour. The blizzard came unexpectedly on a relatively warm day, and many people were caught unaware, including children in one-room schoolhouses. When the storm hit, it caught so many settlers by surprise that between 250 and 500 people died that weekend, according to estimates by newspaper editors in Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, and the Dakota Territory. Many of the dead were children. Some teachers kept their students sheltered in the schoolhouses and saved them. Others released the children to walk home, and those children walked directly into a blizzard with zero visibility and temperatures that killed in minutes. Children were found frozen in fields, found huddled together under haystacks, found within sight of their own farmhouses, having lost their way in the whiteout, and wandered past their front doors without knowing it. The event became known as the Schoolchildren's Blizzard, not because adults didn't die in it, but because the defining image, the one that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives, was children in thin school clothes, lost in white nothing, unable to find their way home. Number 5. Frontier babies were given opium to keep them quiet. When a frontier baby wouldn't stop crying, which happened as babies tend to do, the solution available to most frontier parents was a bottle from the general store. It was called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, or Godfrey's Cordial, or any number of other warmly branded products designed for the care of infants. The active ingredient, in most cases, was opium, sometimes alcohol, sometimes both. A few patent medicines were laced with alcohol, morphine, opium, or cocaine, and marketed for children. A mother on the frontier, exhausted from work, grief, isolation, and the relentless demands of infant care, would give her baby a measured dose from the bottle. The baby would quiet. The mother could sleep. The baby would sleep too, chemically sedated, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. Not until 1906 did the Pure Food and Drug Act demand that ingredients appear on medicine labels. For decades before that law, frontier parents administered opium to their infants, believing they were giving medicine. Some infants overdosed. Many became dependent. The quiet, peaceful baby sleeping in the corner of the sod house was not at peace. It was sedated. Number 6. Children on the Oregon Trail buried their parents and kept walking. The Oregon Trail stretched 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon. Between 1840 and 1870, hundreds of thousands of people walked it, and every mile of that trail was lined with graves. It is estimated that 1 out of every 17 people did not survive their journey to the end of the Oregon Trail. Some estimates state between 20,000 and 30,000 pioneers died on the Oregon Trail. Many of those who died were parents, and the children who survived them faced an impossible choice: turn back or keep going with strangers. Most kept going. There is one story of an orphaned baby who was passed from breast to breast to be fed by the nursing mothers of the wagon train. Strangers who kept a child alive through collective will and biological generosity. Older children, 10, 12, 14 years old, sometimes took charge of younger siblings after both parents died and finished the journey themselves. Arriving in Oregon or California, having lost everything familiar, every face they knew, every voice they recognized, and stepping into an utterly unknown world with only the children they had protected beside them. These children were not celebrated. There was no ceremony waiting for them. They arrived. They found someone willing to take them in. They started over. They were children, acting by necessity like adults. Number 7. The one-room schoolhouse. Every age, one teacher, no heat, 3 months a year. Hollywood's Frontier School is a charming wooden building with a cheerful teacher and bright-eyed children. The reality was considerably more complicated. The one-room schoolhouse was a staple of Western folklore and, in fact, a reality in most small communities of the Old West. One teacher, every grade from 1st through 8th, and sometimes older, in a single room. Children ranging from 5 to 18 years old, all learning simultaneously. Some kids rarely made it to school. It was too far or too cold. School on the frontier ran, in many communities, only during winter, when children weren't needed for planting or harvest. A frontier child might receive 3 or 4 months of formal schooling per year, if that. If the weather was manageable, if the teacher hadn't left, if the family could spare the child. Female teachers earned about half of what male teachers earned. Teachers were often invited to live with one of the families. It helped supplement their earnings, but they had to do chores. The teacher who came to a frontier schoolhouse was often barely older than her oldest students. Many were 17 or 18 years old, hired not because of credentials, but because they could read and write, and were willing to endure the isolation. They lived in strangers' homes. They had no authority beyond what the community chose to grant them. And in the coldest weather, with no reliable heating source, frontier children learned to read with their coats on, their breath visible in the air, their fingers too cold to grip a pencil properly. Number 8. 250,000 children were placed on trains and sent to strangers. Between 1854 and 1929, something extraordinary happened in American history, and almost no one alive today knows it occurred. The orphan trains operated between 1854 and 1929, relocating about 200,000 children. Children from the overcrowded streets and orphanages of New York City were loaded onto trains and sent west, to be distributed to frontier families who had placed orders for them. When the children arrived in the new area where they were to live, there was no formal process to place them with new families. There were only handbills that announced the distribution of groups of needy children that brought crowds of prospective parents to view and choose children. Crowds. Choosing children from a group standing on a platform. Some children were welcomed by new families and towns. Others were beaten, mistreated, taunted, or ignored. City children were expected to perform hard farm labor, for which they were neither emotionally nor physically prepared. Many of them, first-generation immigrants from Italy, Poland, and Ireland, were teased for their strange accents, siblings were often separated, and contact between them was discouraged. The co-founders of the orphan train movement claimed that these children were orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless. But this was not always true. They were mostly the children of new immigrants. Some of those children had living parents, parents too poor to keep them, parents who signed their children onto trains believing they were giving them a better life, not always knowing they might never see them again. Some drifted from home to find someone who wanted them. Many ran away. The orphan train was a desperate solution to a real and overwhelming problem. It was also, for many of the children aboard it, one of the loneliest experiences a human being can have, being displayed to strangers and waiting to find out which one, if any, would choose you. Number 9. Native American children were taken from their families by force. While frontier settler children endured poverty, isolation, and hard labor, the children of Native American families experienced something of an entirely different category. There were more than 526 government-funded and often church-run Indian boarding schools across the U.S. in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents, sent to schools hundreds of miles away, and beaten, starved, or otherwise abused when they spoke their native languages. In 1879, the first government-run boarding school, located off a reservation, opened its doors. Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded by U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. Among the first students at Carlisle were the children of Apache prisoners of war who had been captured after their leader Geronimo surrendered. Pratt's stated philosophy, now recognized as a declaration of cultural genocide, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. When students arrived at boarding schools, their lives altered dramatically. They were given short haircuts, required to wear uniforms, and to take English names. The children were not allowed to speak their own languages, even between each other. Discipline included assignment of extra chores, solitary confinement, and corporal punishment, including beatings by teachers using sticks, rulers, and belts. In the most extreme cases, law enforcement took children at gunpoint. Parents who resisted sending their children to these schools were often severely punished. Government officials withheld food rations that families depended on. A child could be taken from their mother, placed on a train, transported hundreds of miles, stripped of their name, their language, their clothing, their hair, and told they should be grateful, that this was civilization, that this was help. The graves of children who never came home are still being found on the grounds of these schools. Number 10. Frontier girls were expected to marry as young as 14. Childhood for frontier girls ended early, not when they finished school, not when they turned 18, but when a suitable marriage arrangement was made. In many frontier communities, girls married between the ages of 14 and 16. This was not considered unusual. It was not considered a tragedy. In a world where women had no legal independence, no property rights, and where a family's survival often depended on alliances between households, a daughter's marriage was an economic transaction as much as a personal one. Diaries and journals of women on the frontier revealed that the dissolution of bonds with other women contributed heavily to their sense of dislocation. A girl of 15, married to a man of 30, relocated to a homestead 50 miles from her family, responsible for cooking, cleaning, sewing, childbearing, and managing a household, had, in the space of a single ceremony, moved from childhood to full adult responsibility, and she was expected to begin having children almost immediately. On average, a woman had 6 to 9 children in her lifetime, with that number exceeding 10 in many cases. For girls who had watched their own mothers exhaust themselves bearing and burying children, who had worked since age 5, who had received perhaps 2 years of formal schooling. Marriage was not a beginning. It was a continuation of the labor that had defined their entire lives. Number 11. The Grasshopper Plague of 1874 terrified an entire generation of children. Imagine looking up at the sky and watching the sun disappear, not behind clouds, behind insects. In late July 1874, countless grasshoppers, also called Rocky Mountain locusts, descended upon the Great Plains. From the Dakotas in the north to Texas in the south, the insects arrived in swarms so large that they blocked out the sun. Witnesses say it sounded like a rainstorm. For children who had never seen anything like it, the arrival of the locusts was genuinely apocalyptic. The sound alone, millions of insects descending simultaneously, was described by survivors as one of the most terrifying sounds they had ever heard. The grasshoppers ate the water-starved crops still in the ground. Paper, tree bark, and wooden tool handles were devoured. They consumed the wool from live sheep. They even ate the clothing right off people's backs. Frontier children watched their families' entire year of work, the planted fields that represented survival through the coming winter, consumed in hours. They watched their parents stand in ruined fields in silence. Some parents cried, some simply didn't speak for days. For a child who understood, even imperfectly, what the harvest meant for whether the family ate that winter, watching it vanish in an afternoon was a particular kind of terror. The kind that doesn't appear in nightmares about monsters. The kind that comes from understanding that the world can simply take everything, without warning, without mercy, without explanation. Number 12. Children delivered babies alone when no one else was there. On the frontier, the nearest doctor could be a day's ride away, sometimes 2. When a baby decided to arrive, it arrived, regardless of who was present. Diaries and historical accounts document numerous cases of frontier women giving birth assisted only by their older children. Girls of 10, 11, 12 years old, following instructions their mothers managed to give between contractions, or following instructions learned from watching previous births. Pioneers William and Kate Campen, who lived in a small sod house in Marion, Dakota Territory, were caught unprepared when a blizzard hit. William was forced to leave for town, and while he was gone, 19-year-old Kate gave birth alone to their first son, Henry Royal Campen, on January 8th. Kate Campen was 19 and gave birth entirely alone, without assistance, during a blizzard, in a sod house on the Dakota Prairie. She was not unusual, she was typical. Frontier children grew up understanding human biology in ways that no textbook could have taught them. They were present at births. They were present at deaths. The body, in all its vulnerability, its need, its failure, was not hidden from them. It was the central fact of their domestic world, and when the need arose, as it sometimes did, a 12-year-old girl helped bring her sibling into the world, and then she made supper. Number 13. Loneliness was the most common word in frontier children's diaries. Read enough frontier children's diaries, and one word appears more than any other, more than hunger, more than fear, more than cold. Lonely. Historians offer a portrait of loneliness, privation, and demanding physical labor from an early age as the defining experience of frontier childhood. And of all the hardships, the work, the weather, the disease, the death, the loneliness may have been the most quietly devastating. Frontier homesteads were separated by miles of open prairie. A child might go weeks, months, without seeing another child their own age. Their companions were younger siblings, parents worn thin by labor, and the endless, indifferent landscape stretching to every horizon. The dissolution of bonds with other women contributed heavily to women's sense of dislocation on the frontier. when these women wrote longingly of the homes they left behind. Home meant their close bonds with mothers, sisters, and friends, and they grieved over the loss of those relationships. For children, who had not yet developed the internal resources that adults could draw on, the isolation was even more acute. There was no one to play with, no one who understood the private language of childhood. No neighborhood, no street, no sound of other children's voices carrying across the yard. There was work, there was family, and there was the prairie, vast, silent, and utterly unconcerned with the loneliness of the small human standing in the middle of it. Number 14. Frontier children treated their own wounds without medical help. On the frontier, the doctor was not coming. Everyone understood this, and so children, like their parents, learned to treat injuries themselves. Snake bites were packed with mud or tobacco and watched carefully. Deep cuts were cleaned with whatever whiskey was available and bound with strips of cloth torn from clothing. Burns were treated with lard. Broken bones were set by whoever was present and had the steadiest hands, which was sometimes an older sibling. Settlers relied on granny medicine, home remedies passed from mother to daughter over the years. This knowledge was transmitted not in medical schools, but in kitchens and fields, mothers teaching daughters who would teach their own daughters. Willow bark for fever, poultices for infection, specific plants for specific conditions, learned from experience and from the generations before. Some families also put their faith in books such as Gunn's Domestic Medicine or The Poor Man's Friend, one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. A 12-year-old frontier girl might know how to treat a snake bite, set a simple fracture, manage a fever with herbal compresses, and deliver a lamb in a difficult birth, because these were skills required for survival, and survival did not wait for the right age to begin teaching them. Number 15. Children in mining camps lived among violence and vice from birth. Not all frontier children grew up on farms and homesteads. Thousands were born into the chaos of mining boomtowns, places that erupted from nothing, attracted thousands of men, and offered almost no infrastructure for family life. In California's gold rush camps of the 1850s, a child was a remarkable sight. In the gold camps of California, cholera, malaria, typhoid, and scurvy struck down even the hardiest fortune seekers. Children in these camps had no school, no playground, no neighborhood. Their daily environment was a place built entirely around adult male vice, gambling, drinking, commercial sex, and the violence that naturally accompanied it. They played in the mud beside saloon walls. They fell asleep to the sounds of arguments and gunfire. They learned to identify the signs of a man drunk enough to be dangerous before most children in other parts of the country had learned the multiplication table. And yet accounts from these children, recorded decades later, are not uniformly grim. Some remembered the mining camps with a strange, fierce affection. The community of men who, despite everything, looked after the few children among them. The gamblers who made sure a child got fed. The miners who taught them to pan for gold and cheered when they found color in the pan. Children adapt. They find warmth in the strangest places, and some found it in boomtowns that had no right to contain it. Number 16. Frontier children saw their first gunfight before their first birthday party. For children growing up in frontier towns, in Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, violence was not an abstraction. It was a sound they recognized, a thing they understood could happen at any moment. Gunfights occurred in the street outside the general store. Arguments ended with blades in saloons they walked past every day. Men they recognized, the blacksmith, the barkeep, the man who sold their father ammunition, turned up dead on a Monday morning after a Saturday dispute. Frontier children learned early that adult disagreement had a different texture than it did in the stories their parents told about back east, that the man who smiled at you on Tuesday could be in the ground by Thursday, that the world was not arranged to protect the innocent simply because they were innocent. This awareness that violence was possible at any moment, from any direction, shaped the psychology of an entire generation of frontier children. It made them watchful. It made them calm in situations that would paralyze modern adults. And it contributed to the haunted quality that appears in so many adult accounts of frontier childhood. A nostalgia shadowed by the understanding that nothing about it had actually been safe. Number 17. The Sod House. Children who lived in walls of dirt and grass. On the Great Plains, where trees were scarce and lumber expensive, the frontier family's first home was built from the earth itself. Blocks of sod, grass, roots, and packed dirt, cut from the prairie and stacked into walls. A sod roof, a dirt floor, windows, if they were lucky, made of greased paper or a single precious pane of glass. Many settlers lived in sod houses, which did a remarkable job insulating the home during the scorching summer months and brutal winter months. But insulation came at a price. Sod walls hosted insects, beetles, centipedes, spiders, that fell from the ceiling onto sleeping children. Snakes occasionally entered through gaps in the walls, seeking warmth. After rain, the roof dripped mud for days. The dirt floor turned to slick clay. Children who grew up in these homes, who did their schoolwork by oil lamp in a room carved from the earth, who woke to find beetles on their bedding, who spent winters in spaces no larger than a modern bathroom with their entire family, developed a relationship with physical discomfort that had no modern equivalent. And yet, the diaries describe pride in these houses, the pride of a family that built something from nothing, that created shelter on open ground where no shelter had existed. The sod house was dark and cold and alive with insects. It was also home. And for frontier children, home, whatever it looked like, was everything. Number 18. Children walked miles to school through genuine danger. The walk to school on the frontier was not a pleasant stroll through a neighborhood. It was a genuine expedition across open prairie in weather that could kill, past terrain that held real hazards. Children walked 2, 3, 5 miles each way, in summer heat that could reach 110 degrees with no shade, in winter cold with blizzards that could descend in minutes, across ground where rattlesnakes were common, where coyotes prowled, where a twisted ankle miles from home was a serious crisis. For persons living on the 19th century frontier, education was not something taken for granted. Parents who sent children on these walks did so knowing the risk. Parents who kept children home knew the cost. A day less education in a life where education was already desperately scarce. Diary accounts from teachers describe children arriving at school soaked through from creek crossings. Children who had been chased by animals. Children who arrived late because they had stopped to help an injured calf. Children who arrived not at all, and whose absence meant a teacher spent the day wondering whether something had happened on the walk. Something sometimes had. Number 19. Frontier children were responsible for siblings when parents couldn't be there. The oldest child in a frontier family occupied a role with no modern equivalent. Not quite a parent, not quite a sibling. Something in between, carrying responsibility that most adults today have never experienced, at an age when most modern children are still being driven to soccer practice. When parents went to town, a journey that could take all day, the oldest child ran the house, fed the animals, managed the younger children, made decisions, handled emergencies alone. Diary accounts describe 13-year-old girls managing households of 5 or 6 younger siblings for days at a time when both parents were ill with fever. 12-year-old boys making the decision to slaughter an animal when a storm threatened the food supply, then processing the meat themselves because there was no one else to do it, and it needed to be done. Historians write that rural upbringing promoted family interdependence, and in the end, produced children who were more self-reliant, mobile, adaptable, responsible, and independent than their urban counterparts. This is true. It is also worth naming what it cost. A childhood spent carrying adult responsibility is not a stolen childhood. Not exactly. But it is a compressed one, a brief one. A childhood that ends not with a graduation or a birthday, but with a quiet, unremarked morning when a child looks around and realizes, without anyone having to say it, that they are no longer a child. Number 20. Frontier children played with almost nothing and invented everything. A modern child surrounded by screens, toys, organized activities, and the constant stimulation of contemporary childhood might struggle to imagine what frontier children did for fun. The answer was almost anything they could think of. Pioneer kids didn't have many toys. In fact, children in general didn't have many toys until the late 1800s. Pioneer kids might have played with a toy Noah's Ark, a popular toy then. Girls may have learned to sew while making homemade dolls. There weren't many picture books, pencils, paper, paints, or crayons either. When they weren't helping their parents, children mostly made up games or played together. Community events were social occasions of genuine intensity. Spelling bees were a boot-stompin' good time. Children and adults would come from all over to see a spelling bee. That sentence, children and adults coming from all over for a spelling competition, tells you everything about the nature of frontier entertainment. When stimulation is scarce, everything becomes meaningful. A spelling bee is not merely academic. It is the social event of the season. It is the thing people plan for, dress for, travel for. Frontier children played in rivers and haystacks and open fields. They chased animals and built things from mud and ran races with no finish line. Their toys were sticks and stones and each other. Their entertainment was whatever they could imagine. And historical accounts suggest they imagined quite a lot. Number 21. Frontier children wrote diaries that nobody read for 100 years. Across the archives of universities, historical societies, and private families, there are thousands of diaries written by frontier children that were never published, never celebrated, never read outside the family that kept them. They describe ordinary days with extraordinary honesty, the death of a cow and the crisis that followed, the first snow and the fear it brought, a new neighbor arriving across the prairie and the celebration that greeted them as if royalty had arrived, the taste of store-bought candy encountered for the first time, described with a precision and wonder that no adult account could match. Beginning in the 1840s, hundreds of thousands of people headed west from the United States into its territories and beyond. Many left behind detailed journals and wrote long letters to friends and family back home. Children wrote too, in careful, imperfect handwriting, in pencil stubs saved from school, on pages torn from ledger books when proper paper wasn't available. And in those pages is the truest record we have of what frontier childhood actually felt like from the inside, not from the outside looking in, not from adults reconstructing their memories, but from children in the moment, writing down what happened today and what they thought about it. Some of those diaries describe days of genuine, uncomplicated happiness, playing in the creek, a holiday meal, a letter arrived from family back east, and some describe things no child should ever have had to write down. Both are part of the record. Both are true. Number 22. A child's first gun was a working tool, not a toy. On the frontier, a boy received his first rifle not as a rite of passage or a gift. He received it because there was work that needed doing, and he was now old enough to do it. By 10 or 11, many frontier boys were expected to hunt, not for sport, but for food. Squirrel, rabbit, deer, prairie chicken, whatever the land provided, whatever the family needed. They were also expected to protect. In the absence of fathers working the far fields, in the isolation of homesteads miles from any neighbor, a boy with a rifle was the household's last line of defense against animal threats. Wolves circling the livestock, coyotes near the chickens, the rare but genuine danger of human threat in a landscape where law enforcement might be a day's ride away. Diary accounts describe boys of 8 and 9 shooting rattlesnakes in the yard, while their mothers stood on the porch watching. Boys of 12 riding out alone to investigate why the cattle were making noise at the edge of the property. This was not recklessness, it was training. It was a child learning, systematically and deliberately, to do what the frontier required. And the frontier required things that no child in any other time or place has ever been required to provide. Number 23. Frontier children built America, and history forgot them. Every frontier town that eventually became a city, every railroad that opened new territory, every farm that fed a growing nation, every school, every church, every court of law built on the western frontier. All of it was built by people who had been frontier children, the generation born on those homesteads and in those mining camps and on those wagon trains, who worked before they could read, who buried siblings before they reached adulthood, who carried adult responsibility in children's bodies. They grew up to build the country that followed. They built it with a competence born of necessity, a resilience born of having no alternative, a practical relationship with hardship that made them extraordinarily capable, and sometimes quietly unable to understand why the generations that followed them found things difficult. Because from where they stood, from the vantage point of a childhood spent in a sod house, in a blizzard, with a dead sibling in the next room, and a rifle in the corner, and chores to finish before dark, very little that came after seemed genuinely hard. They were not superhuman. They were children, shaped by circumstances beyond anyone's choosing, who became exactly what those circumstances required. Number 24. The Donner Party's survivors were mostly children. In the winter of 1846, in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, 87 members of the Donner Party became snowbound in circumstances that have haunted American history ever since. The group faced starvation. The rescue came too late for many, and in the desperate months before it arrived, some of the survivors turned to cannibalism to stay alive. Nearly half the members of the Donner Party were children. The account of the survivors' experiences focuses on the children's experiences, making it uniquely compelling. Nearly half. Children who watched adults make decisions no adult should ever have to make. Children who were shielded from the worst of what happened, or who were not shielded and carried it for the rest of their lives. The Donner Party children who survived, and many did survive at rates higher than the adults, carried memories of that winter into long lives. Some spoke of it, many didn't. Several lived into the 20th century, into a world of automobiles and electricity and refrigeration, still carrying inside them the winter of 1846 in the Sierra Nevada. They were the last people alive who knew what that winter had actually been, and most of them took it to their graves without saying everything they knew. Number 25. The most resilient generation America ever produced left almost no monuments. We build monuments to generals, to presidents, to outlaws who became legends. We do not build monuments to the children, not to the 10-year-old girl who wrote 2 sentences about her brother's death and then described supper, not to the 12-year-old boy who finished the journey west after both parents died on the trail, not to the 9-year-old who helped deliver her sibling on a dirt floor because there was no one else, not to the hundreds of thousands who arrived on orphan trains and stood on platforms waiting to find out if anyone would choose them. The nature of childhood on the American frontier is disputed among historians. One group argues that the rural environment produced children who were more self-reliant, mobile, adaptable, responsible, and independent. Others offer a portrait of loneliness, privation, and demanding physical labor from an early age. Both are true, both happened, and neither tells the complete story of what it meant to be a child on the American frontier. Because the complete story is in the diaries, in handwriting that grew more confident across the pages of a single notebook as a child became something else, something harder, something more capable, something marked by the specific kind of knowledge that comes only from having survived things you weren't supposed to have to survive at that age. They survived them anyway. They built the country we live in, and most of them are buried in places with no markers at all. Tell me in the comments, which secret hit you hardest? The babies given opium to keep them quiet, the children standing on train platforms waiting to be chosen, the Native American children taken at gunpoint, or the 10-year-old who wrote about her brother's death in 2 sentences and then described supper. Because that last one is the one I can't stop thinking about. Subscribe, because these children deserve to be remembered, and we're just getting started.